RC here, and today I'll be going over a popular topic concerning the canon of the biblical books. That's right, the Apocrypha. What does it contain? And why are these books not canon? Let's take a look into this. The Apocrypha is a collection of books that are interesting and are a collection of intertestamental period writings, as well as some possible first century documents. It really depends on what we are dealing with and the different theories. The term Apocrypha means secret or hidden. However, that doesn't mean that this is some sort of secret or hidden canon or set of books of scripture. While the term can refer to other books, we will only focus on the books that are popularly referred to in the Apocrypha collections that you can buy, which means no reference to Enoch or the sorts. The list of the Apocrypha books include 1st and 2nd Esdras, Tobit, Judith, additions to Esther, the Wisdom of Solomon, Ecclesiasticus, Baruch, the Letter of Jeremiah, the Prayer of Isaiah, Susanna, Bel and the Dragon, the Prayer of Manasseh, and 1st to 2nd Maccabees. Now, what exactly are these books? Well, simply put, it depends on the genre of the apocryphal books. For example, 1st and 2nd Maccabees are books that are historical and relate to us history of a time of oppression to the Jews, followed by a Jewish revolt against their pagan oppressors. You also have books like the Letter of Jeremiah and the Bel and the Dragon letters, which are aimed to be more polemical books. Then you have historical fiction like 1st Esdras, Susanna, and Judith, which have some historical roots, yet can still relate a fictional version of something that existed. So it's pretty much similar to the Bible concerning discerning and figuring out genre. However, the next question that must be asked is whether or not they are considered canon. The main way to answer this question is considering the fact of the Jewish understanding of it. Romans chapter 3 verse 2 says, "Much every way chiefly because that unto them," which is referring to Jews here in the context, "were committed the oracles of God." The Greek for committed here is pisteuo, which means to be entrusted with a thing, according to Thayer's Greek lexicon. So they've been entrusted with the oracles of God. The New Testament scholar Douglas J. Moo says the following in page 182 concerning this word. The general meaning of the word gives rise to a plethora of suggestions about its specific reference here. Unmistakably divine utterances of the Old Testament, God's self-revelation in both the Old and New Testament, the law, especially the Decalogue, and the promises of the Old Testament, or the Old Testament as a whole with special reference, perhaps, to the promises. Of these alternatives, the last suits best the general application of the word in the Septuagint, LXX, and the New Testament. So, with this being said, we must examine how the early Jews would have viewed this literature. We already have one objection from those that propose we should view the Apocrypha as canon. They will say that the idea of Jews deciding the canon is ridiculous and that their testimony is to be dismissed because they don't believe in the Messiah. They crucified the Messiah. This is, of course, a genetic fallacy. What they believe is irrelevant to the issue of whether or not that what they do believe or affirm is true. Should we also dismiss the idea of monotheism because they too affirmed monotheism? If they affirm the Torah is scripture, should we forsake the Torah as being scripture? We can ask all kinds of other questions and follow this line of reasoning to its own logical conclusions, and of course, we will encounter some problems as a result. Another point made is that we are trying to establish something that BC era Jews affirmed. So obviously you have Jews who didn't accept Christ in their time since Christ wasn't born. That wasn't part of their covenant either. Our first testimony of the canon goes to Josephus in Against Apion, where he states, quote, "For we have not an innumerable multitude of books among us, disagreeing from and contradicting one another, as the Greeks have, but only 22 books, which contain the records of all the past times, which are justly believed to be divine. And of them 5 belong to Moses, which contain his laws, and the traditions of the origin of mankind till his death." Goes on to say, "The prophets who were after Moses wrote down what was done in their times in 13 books. The remaining 4 books contain hymns to God and precepts for the conduct of human life. 'Tis true our history hath been written since Artaxerxes, very particularly, but hath not esteemed of the like authority with the former by our forefathers, because there hath not been an exact succession of prophets since that time, and how firmly we have been given credit to these books of our own nation is evident by what we do. For during so many ages have already passed, no one has been so bold as either to add anything to them, to take anything from them, or to make any change in them. But it has become natural to all Jews immediately, and from their very birth, to esteem these books to contain divine doctrines, and to persist in them, and if occasion be, willingly to die for them. A very lengthy quote, I will admit, but Josephus makes a lot of statements here in his letter in defending what his Jewish people affirmed, and as a historian even noted how they viewed the books. Now you might be also wondering why he says 22 books, when we say, as Protestants, 39. Well, the fact is that some books back then were considered part of the same book. The best example being the 12 minor prophets all being lumped into one book. It again depends on the Jew, which also leads to the Talmud in Baba Batra 14b with their canon list, as well as Philo of Alexandria's canon list. By the way, Josephus and Philo will be important for a future point in this video. Notice that there is a threefold division of the books when we go to the sources, usually referred to as the Law, Prophets, and Psalms. These would be the first 5 books of Moses, the prophet historical writings, as well as the wisdom literature. So whenever one wants to go over this stuff, they must consider where each book goes concerning categories. Another way of showing this threefold division in a different way was from the Apocrypha book known as Ecclesiasticus, also known as the Wisdom of Ben Sirach. In the prologue of this book, which can be accessed online or in your own copy of the Apocrypha, we read the following. Whereas many and great things have been delivered unto us by the law and the prophets, and by others that have followed their steps, for the which things Israel ought to be commended for learning and wisdom. Goes on to say, my grandfather, Jesus, when he had much given himself to the reading of the law and the prophets and other books of our fathers, and had gotten therein good judgment, was drawn on also himself to write something pertaining to learning and wisdom, to the intent that those who are desirous to learn and are addicted to these things might profit much more in living according to the law. Now to settle with the Council of Jamnia theory. Many scholars postulate that a council of rabbis in 90 AD got together to decide on which books would be part of the Hebrew canon. However, this just isn't true. There's 2 ways to approach this depending on the data, and I'll simply leave y'all with the info for you to make the decision yourself. The first one being that there is really no Council of Jamnia. There really isn't any evidence of this council, and I couldn't find any ancient discourse or mention of such a council. The only thing that seems to give rise to this theory is Mishnah Yarim, chapter 3-5. I don't know if they use chapters or not for this thing, but where it mentions people, they had a debate on Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes as scripture. But some rabbis, as this Mishnah points out, said that the early Jews didn't have such a debate. In fact, another problem dealing with this is about Josephus. If he is such a good Jewish historian, who even goes to refer to the canon of the Jews, why does he not mention this whole debate? Jack P. Lewis says the following, quote, the Council of Jamnia hypothesis has from the start had difficulty accounting for Josephus. He knows nothing of such a gathering, and he had been in Rome approximately 20 years when, about 90 AD or CE, he writes of the Jews' 22 sacred books, justly accredited, claiming antiquity for this position. Thackeray, and he goes on to say, Thackeray grants that Josephus, claiming to be a Pharisee, was representing a Pharisaic viewpoint and implies that the canon had long been closed. Likewise, we also have from Sid Lehman, who also says, quote, the widespread view that the Council of Jamnia closed the biblical canon or that it canonized any books at all is not supported by the evidence and need no longer be seriously maintained. I am one of the few rare Protestants today who thinks that Jamnia is a bad argument to use. However, that still doesn't negate what Romans 3:2 says, and that is that the early Jews are the ones that determined the canon, and that this is what the scholars are saying, and understanding that to mean, as well as pointing out the history of the Apocrypha, as well as the history of the canon debate in general. The second way to deal with it is to show it doesn't decide the canon, but that books already belonged in a pre-existing canon. Dr. Walter Kaiser, who thinks the Apocrypha isn't part of the canon, says the following, quote, "It is true, of course, that rabbis Johann ben Zakkai, who escaped the siege of Jerusalem, is said to have asked the Roman general permission to re-establish his school at Jamnia, which is Jamnia." Further goes on to say, nevertheless, despite all the long history of footnotes and arguments to the contrary, the thesis that Jamnia determined the shape and content of the Old Testament canon has three basis flaws. All deliberations by the council had no binding authority. 2. Only the book of Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon were discussed, and even that discussion was basically about how to interpret these books, not whether they were canonical or not. And 3. The books that were treated as canonical in their discussions did not differ from the list found in Josephus. So even if this council did occur, it wasn't even discussing the Apocrypha, but concerning books that had been part of the canon long before this hypothetical council. While most proponents of the Apocrypha appealed to the Church Fathers, they failed to understand something. The Church Fathers had different canon lists. Edmund L. Gallagher and John D. Mead give a pretty exhaustive list and exposition of the early church canon list that show that each of the Church Fathers had a different set of lists. And if you were to ask me for mine, I'd be more inclined to view a canon similar to Melito, the bishop of Sardis. His words, preserved by Eusebius, record the following with brackets from me. "I accurately ascertain the books of the Old Testament and send them to thee here below. The names are as follows. Of Moses, 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Jesus' name, which is Joshua. Judges, Ruth. 4 of Kings, 2 of Paralabomena, that is Chronicles. Psalms of David. Proverbs of Solomon, which is also called Wisdom, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, Job. Of prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah. Of the 12 prophets, 1 book, Daniel, Ezekiel, Esdras, which is Ezra." The scholar F.F. Bruce comments by saying, quote, "It is likely that Melito included Lamentations with Jeremiah and Nehemiah with Ezra, though it is curious to find Ezra counted among the prophets. In that case, his list contains all the books of the Hebrew canon arranged according to the Septuagint order, with the exception of Esther. Esther may not have been included in the list he received from his informants. Thus I said he's the closest a Protestant would lean to for a canon in the early church, without necessarily going all the way." Now, another argument used is to say that the early church, including Jesus and his apostles, used the Septuagint. Now, what is the Septuagint? The Septuagint, of course, being the Greek Old Testament. Therefore, we should consider the books in it as canon. While the Septuagint does contain the Apocrypha, there are some serious problems with this view. First of all, they don't realize there are books in here at times that you wouldn't view as canonical. Secondly, the Septuagint is actually just a collection of Jewish books. In page 17 of De Silva's book on the Apocrypha, he writes, quote, "A fifth persistent factor that has clouded this discussion is the concept of an Alexandrian Jewish canon of scripture that was broader than the Palestinian Jewish canon. This is based on a lack of clarity about the meaning of the term Septuagint and can be illustrated by considering a severe misstatement of the facts." It goes on to say that the work undertaken in the 3rd century BCE in Alexandria involved only the Greek translation of the Pentateuch, clearly the scope envisioned by letter of Aristides, an earlier if embellished account of the translation project. And then continues by saying, "The Septuagint codices cannot be used as evidence for a pre-Christian Alexandrian Jewish canon that included the Apocrypha. These manuscripts are 4th and 5th century Christian works, fail to agree on the extent of the extra books, and seem to have been compiled more with convenience and reference in mind than the standards of canonical versus non-canonical books. So when it comes to even the codices, like Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, we must realize they aren't the standard to determine canon. Plus, the Septuagint is just a collection of Jewish works. That's like saying that a great writing collection of Lewis in one volume book that includes all of the Narnia series while also including Mere Christianity and the Great Divorce means that somehow Mere Christianity is canon to the Narnia story. Another important detail about this is that both Philo and Josephus would have been using the Septuagint. Philo was a Hellenized Jew who for the most part only read from the Greek, and Josephus may have had some Hebrew knowledge, but some of his citations in Antiquities of the Jews seem to indicate he was familiar with and utilizing the literature of the Apocrypha, especially from the Septuagint. In fact, Book 12 of Antiquities is where we can find the story of 1st and 2nd Maccabees summed up. Yet remember that both Josephus and Philo affirmed the Protestant canon, if not a canon lacking the Apocrypha. So just because some utilize the Septuagint doesn't mean they view all of the books that are in the Septuagint as scripture. Of course, they may also mention the Dead Sea Scrolls, but again, this includes the Book of Enoch. Just because they had certain books didn't mean they were canon. We must treat these collections with heavy study and consider the context of the Jews of their time to understand how they would have viewed these books. So the books, however, can be treated and used to our benefit as Protestants, if we treat them, of course, as something for devotional tools or understanding of the pre-Christian Jewish culture. It also helps to understand history and prophecy fulfillment. I did a video a while back addressing that the book of 2nd Maccabees actually proves a prophecy instead of what Ellen G. White's cult of Seventh-day Adventists affirm. Even Martin Luther, while not viewing them as canon, would still translate them into his Bible. De Silva says the following, quote, "Martin Luther's treatment of these books is even more positive. Most notably, he took the pains to translate them and to publish them in his German Bible. His innovation was to move the disputed books, along with the disputed additions to Daniel, to a section between the Testaments. His verdict on them, found in his preface to the Apocrypha, echoes Jerome. These are books that, though not esteemed like the Holy Scriptures, are still both useful and good to read. He positively encourages the reading of several of these books. In his preface to the Wisdom of Solomon, he writes, 'There are many good things in it, and it is well worth reading. This book is a good exposition and example of the first commandment, and that is the main reason why this book is to be read, so that one may learn to fear and trust God, so that he may help us by his grace.' So while the canon is that of the Protestants, as even the New Catholic Encyclopedia admits by saying, quote, 'For the Old Testament Protestants follow the Jewish canon,' we should still consider the Apocrypha useful and beneficial. Just like how sermons, commentaries, devotionals, and scholarly books can help us out, so too can the Apocrypha help us out in more ways than just viewing it as scripture for salvation and doctrine. It can help us out a lot more than how scripture does with salvation. For example, to edify us, to build us up, and to educate us. I'm going to be showing you a few resources on the screen that you can either go buy or download that will help you out in your studies for this that I haven't showed on the screen in quotes from the previous parts of this video. But I hope that these will help you out, and hopefully this video has been of use to those who have had questions about this subject. This has been RC Apologist. Take care.